In the heart of a city that never stops moving, Kaito's world had shrunk to the dimensions of a drafting table. For him, the sky was not a canvas of blue but a series of vertical lines and geometric precision. He was a driven young architect whose every breath was dedicated to the upcoming national competition. Winning was not just a goal, it was his identity. His apartment was a graveyard of blueprints illuminated by the sterile, unwavering glow of a small desk lamp. Kaito refused to spend a single second on anything that did not contribute to his future. He believed that to reach the top, one had to cut away the unnecessary weights of life, emotions, leisure, and even those who cared most. Every evening, a soft knock would interrupt the scratching of his pencil. It was Eri, the girl next door, and a constant in his life since childhood, playing together in the park. She was the antithesis of Kaito's cold world, bringing the scent of freshly made homemade miso soup and the warmth of a smile. She would slip into his apartment with a tray, her presence a quiet ripple in his focus. "You need to eat, Kaito," she would say gently, placing a bowl beside his sketches. Kaito would barely grunt a response, his eyes never leaving the intricate lines of his skyscraper design. He took her kindness for granted, seeing her care as domestic noise. To him, Eri was a relic of a childhood he had outgrown, a shadow he was trying to leave behind in his race for success. One rainy Tuesday, Eri arrived with something more than just dinner. She placed a small hand-wrapped box on the corner of his desk. It was a lucky charm she had spent hours making. Before she could explain, Kaito swept it aside to make room for a ruler. The small box tumbled to the hard floor. "Eri, I don't have time for these distractions," he snapped. "This project is my life. I can't be bothered with trinkets." Eri flinched, her hand lingering in the air. She simply bent down, picked up the charm, and placed it on a shelf. Kaito didn't see the way her hand trembled, nor did he notice her paleness under his lights. There were signs, of course. Sometimes she would lean against the doorframe, catching her breath. Once, Kaito saw a prescription bottle tucked away in her purse, but his mind categorized it as something trivial. He was too deep in his own ambitions to look closer. He was building monuments of shining steel, while the most important person in his life was quietly crumbling. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is easy to ignore the cracks in the foundation when you only look at the view from the top floor. As the Summer Lantern Festival drew closer, Eri visited Kaito one final time. She looked dangerously fragile, almost translucent in the evening light. "Kaito," she whispered, "will you come to the festival with me this year? It's very important." She looked at him with eyes that held a silent plea for his time. Kaito's frustration boiled over. He slammed his fist onto the table. "The festival? Are you serious? My career is more important than silly lights and sentimental traditions. Stop acting like a child." The silence was deafening. He didn't look up to see the tears in Eri's eyes or how she clutched her chest. She gave him a small, sad and final smile. "I understand, Kaito," she said softly. "I won't bother you anymore. Good luck." She walked out, closing the door very quietly behind her. Kaito felt a brief pang of guilt, a cold shiver running very slowly down his spine. But he suppressed the feeling and turned back to his work. He had a prestigious competition to win, and in his mind, the silence was finally the blissful peace he had been asking for. The first 24 hours were a relief. Kaito basked in the undisturbed focus he had craved, free from the interruptions that plagued him. There was no gentle tapping at the door, no steam from a bowl of soup fogging his blueprints, and no soft-spoken reminders to rest. His world was once again a temple of logic. Yet as the third day arrived, the silence began to lose its charm. It transformed from a sanctuary into a vacuum, a heavy pressure pushing against his eardrums. Every time he heard a footstep in the hallway, his head instinctively turned toward the door, only to find the handle remained still. The peace he had demanded was now a suffocating shroud, making his apartment feel like a glass cage. The day of the competition results arrived with a clinical brightness. Kaito's name was announced as the grand prize winner, his design hailed as a masterpiece of modern living. He stood on the stage, receiving a trophy that felt colder than he expected. He looked at the sea of strangers, searching for a face that wasn't there. When he returned home, the triumph felt hollow. He held the award in his dark living room, waiting for a knock that never came. He realized with a jolt of terror that the victory meant nothing without Irie. The silence wasn't peace. It was a profound, aching absence. He dropped the trophy and rushed to Arie's apartment. He pounded on the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Arie, open up!" he shouted, his voice cracking. There was no response. A neighbor peeked out, her eyes filled with a pity that made Kaito's blood run cold. She whispered that an ambulance had been seen at the curb nearly a week ago. Stumbling back to his own doorway, Kaito's foot brushed against a small cardboard box wrapped in brown paper tucked in the shadows. Inside, he found a crimson scarf, knitted with thick wool. It was imperfect, with dropped stitches that spoke of tired hands. Tucked into the folds was a letter. The handwriting was shaky, a contrast to her usual elegant script. "Kaito, I'm sorry my presence was a burden to your brilliance," it read. "I only wanted to make sure you didn't forget that even the strongest buildings need a soft place to rest. Wear this when it gets cold. I'll be watching the lanterns for both of us." The realization hit him like a blow. The festival hadn't been about silly lights. It had been her final attempt to hold his hand before letting go of life. Just then, his phone vibrated. It was Arie's mother, her voice a ragged whisper. "Kaito, she's at the city hospital. You need to come now." He didn't wait. He sprinted through the streets, the cold wind biting his face, the red scarf clutched in his hand. He ignored the red lights. His mind a blur of every time he had brushed her off and every meal he had let go, cold in his selfish pursuit of glory. At the hospital, the air was thick with antiseptic and grief. He found Arie's mother in the waiting room, her face aged by sorrow. Through her tears, she told him the truth. Arie had a failing heart, a condition that had worsened over the months. She had refused to tell him because she didn't want to be a distraction while he reached for the stars. She had spent her final energy making sure he was cared for, sacrificing her own comfort to fuel his ambition. Kaito pushed past the nurses, his boots thudding on the linoleum. He reached room 412 just as a frantic alarm began to wail. Through the glass he saw her, small, pale and surrounded by wires. He tried to burst inside, but orderlies held him back. "Arie!" he screamed, his voice tearing through the hallway. "Arie, I'm here!" But her eyes remained closed. The jagged lines on the monitor suddenly smoothed into a single, unending horizontal stroke. The flat line drowned out his own scream. The architect realized he had built his life on sand, and the person who held him up was gone, leaving him alone in a world of empty steel. The hospital room's sterile silence was eventually replaced by the hollow noise of a city that didn't know it had lost its heart. Months dragged by like leaden chains, turning the vibrant colors of the world into a muted monochromatic gray. Kaito was now a celebrated architect, his blueprints sought after by the most prestigious firms in the country. He lived in a penthouse of glass and chrome, a monument to the cold ambition he had once prized above his own soul. But the view from the top was empty. Every sunrise felt like a spotlight on his profound isolation. He had built the towers he dreamed of, but he lived in a tomb of his own making. The peace he had once demanded was now a physical ache in his chest that no amount of professional recognition could soothe. The city moved on, oblivious to the void left behind in his apartment. One afternoon, Kaito visited Irie's mother. The house next door, once full of the scent of home-cooked meals and laughter, was now packed into cardboard boxes. With a trembling hand, her mother handed him a small leather-bound diary. For weeks, Kaito couldn't bring himself to open it, fearing the weight of the secrets it held. When he finally did, the ink hit him harder than any structural failure. Page after page was filled with him. Arie had recorded every time he smiled, every late night he spent working, and every silent prayer she whispered for him. She wrote about her diagnosis not with fear for herself, but with terror that she wouldn't be there to take care of him. She knew she was fading, yet her only regret was that her illness might become a distraction. Kaito wandered to the city park, the place where they had spent countless childhood afternoons under the ancient cherry blossom trees. He sat on a weathered bench, the diary heavy in his lap. The architecture surrounding him, the bridges he had designed and the skyline he had helped shape, suddenly looked fragile and meaningless. He realized with a shattering clarity that every line he had ever drawn was possible only because she was the ground beneath his feet. Her warmth was the actual foundation of his career. She was the hidden structure that allowed him to reach for the sky, and he had treated her like temporary scaffolding to be discarded once the building was finished. The weight of his arrogance finally crushed him. In the middle of the park, the stoic architect collapsed, weeping for the meals he hadn't tasted and the love he had ignored until it was a ghost. As a sudden wind picked up, swirling pink petals in a chaotic dance around him, the light seemed to shift. For a fleeting second, a familiar silhouette appeared near a blooming tree. Eri didn't look sick or pale. She looked exactly as she had in his happiest memories, her eyes sparkling with that stubborn, gentle kindness. She didn't speak, but the warmth of her presence echoed in his mind, a soft whisper telling him that it was okay to forgive himself, that it was time to build something that truly mattered. Then, as quickly as a heartbeat, the vision vanished, leaving only the scent of spring and the rustle of the leaves. Kaito didn't return to his office to design more luxury skyscrapers. Instead, he channeled every cent of his prize money into a new project that shocked the industry. He designed a community center in the heart of their old neighborhood, the Irie Memorial Pavilion. It wasn't a cold structure of glass. It was a sanctuary of wood and natural light, filled with communal kitchens for lonely people to connect. He designed it so that no one in that city would ever have to eat a meal in silence. It was his way of giving back the warmth she had poured into him. The pavilion became a heartbeat for the neighborhood, a place where stories were shared and forgotten faces found recognition. On a quiet morning, a year after her passing, Kaito stood before a modest headstone. The wind carried the faint scent of home-cooked soup from a nearby open window, a small reminder of the simple life she had tried to sustain for him. He placed a perfectly knitted red scarf over the cold granite. "I'm sorry it took so long to understand," he whispered, his voice finally steady. "I love you, Eri. I always have." A single cherry blossom petal drifted down, landing softly on his shoulder like a lingering touch. Kaito wiped his eyes and turned toward the city. He wasn't walking away from her. He was finally living a life that was worthy of the foundation she had built for him.